it's rising, oh, just you watch. I'm stepping into fate. There is no time to waste. I've got that lightning inside me. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made.
Julia, thank you for joining us. We are very, very excited to chat with you today. So thank you so much for carving out the time. I know your schedule is insane.
I'm so glad to be able to make this work and so excited to be here. This is awesome.
Awesome. So let's start. I want to get into your book, but I want to talk first about, you've been a reporter for many years and you've covered so many different stories and topics over the course of a 16, 17-year career at CNBC. So I'm interested in what's a story that you covered that just stands out as maybe like one of the bigger stories that you covered that was impactful for you. And then I'd also love to know, what's the trend or what's the thing that you see that you're excited to be reporting and talking about in the future?
So much in those questions. There's an hour just in answering those questions. So I love my beat. I'm senior media and tech reporter, and I could not imagine a more fascinating time to be covering media, technology, the convergence of these two mega industries. And it's so interesting because, you mentioned the CNBC Disruptor 50. I was just reflecting on how the Disruptor 50 really led me to write my book, but also that there was a story that I covered that inspired me to write the Disruptor 50 that in many ways has defined not just the past 10 plus years of my career, but also the media landscape and the transformation of the media landscape for the past and the tech landscape for the past decade. And that's Facebook's IPO. So I started off covering media. Social media didn't exist as a thing. Nobody cared about it. But my brother, who's younger, was in college at the time, and he was an early user of Facebook. And I remember thinking, we have to cover this company. This company is really having an impact on the advertising industry, on the way people communicate. And this was, 12, 13 years ago. And I said, we need to start covering this company pre-IPO. So for CNBC, which is very much focused on big public companies and on investing opportunities, it didn't really make sense to do that much coverage that wasn't about the investing landscape. But as I covered the Facebook IPO, which you all may remember was kind of a dramatic story, I saw the advantage in covering innovative technologies before the companies are public from an investing and business standpoint. So that experience of covering the Facebook IPO and really knowing a company from the time it was young, which has served me in good stead as I've covered it in the past, 15 years, that inspired me to create the CNBC Disruptor 50 list. So in so many ways, that Facebook narrative, from disruptor to giant, has become sort of the basis of the way I look at technology and the advantage I see and understanding tech trends from the very beginning. So the Disruptor 50, for those who aren't familiar with it, is this idea that investors need to understand the tech trends and the startups long before they're public. If you're going to invest in them eventually, you need to know about them early. And the whole idea of studying disruptive technology is that it is already challenging the status quo. The big public giants have to evolve constantly to keep up because of what the little guys are doing. And so I sort of see that Facebook IPO narrative is kicking off this past decade that I've been doing this Disruptor 50 list, which has become really not just an annual list we publish, but a year-round examination of the tech trends that are really driving change in business and in society. And I just actually got off a conference call prepping for CES this year. And the big theme at the Consumer Electronics Show, for those of you who are lucky enough to not have to go, is this year is supposed to be the year of the metaverse. And of course, we're like, is it really? What is the tech trend this year? How much of it is really about how technology is going to help people weather whatever economic downturn it is that we're about to see. But so for me, it's all about trying to understand, like, what are the lenses through which we can be telling business stories? And so I'm sort of grateful for that Facebook experience for giving me that first lens. So that's my long answer about what's been transformative personal career trajectory and how the business stories have impacted that. And then in terms of what's going on now, I mean, wow, there's so much going on. I cover Disney very closely and used to interview Bob Iger every quarter. And then I interviewed Bob Chapek every quarter. And it's been a fascinating lesson, experiment in different leadership styles and sort of measuring and analyzing what actually works in business leadership, especially in creative fields. So I'm very curious to see what happens in this next generation for the media industry and how it is further transformed by tech, whether it's through things like the metaverse and Web3, or whether it's more about how much consumer behavior changes through this next recession.
So interesting. And it's so interesting to be, early on in Facebook, and now Facebook, is seen as a social media platform that is, for a very different demographic, and, things have changed so significantly.
Then you have Instagram. I mean, and we were just talking about TikTok before we started. So it's just, there are many downsides to getting old, but as a business reporter, not a day goes by that I don't feel so lucky that I haven't been living with these companies for 2 decades. It's
right.
just, it's such a gift to have that kind of depth of experience and perspective. So one way, I'm really glad to be getting older.
I was going to talk to you about the Disruptor 50, but you brought it up. So I want to get right into the book because I think it was amazing. And my disappointment is I don't have it here to hold up.
I got one.
And I'm like, where is my book? So I sent a text to my wife, and it's in Meg's purse because she stole it from me, and my wife's reading your book. So I'm
That's
like,
good. I'll take
now,
that.
Now
That's
I don't have it to hold up. So I thought the book was incredible. I'm curious first, I guess, you highlight so many different people. How did you choose the people that you talk about in the book?
Well,
it's so eclectic.
It's so eclectic, and that was by very intentional. And actually, the book also stemmed from the Disruptor 50. So again, one of my favorite projects, this idea that every year for CNBC, I get to interview every year I interview hundreds of CEOs, but for the Disruptor 50, I really get to dig into these 50 companies, and we look at over 1,000 companies that apply to be on this list. By the way, our applications open January 9th. So if you know any companies that want to apply, it's for private venture-backed companies, so please do. So through the Disruptor 50, I was exposed to a lot of startup founders. As you know, female CEOs in the Fortune 500 are few and far between. Currently, female CEOs represent about 8.5% of the Fortune 500. And that is an all-time high. And I was seeing some of these CEOs pop up more and more. Obviously, there's some very impressive ones like Indra Nooyi, who have really transformed the idea of business leadership. But what I was so interested in the startup space is the statistics were so crazy. There is nowhere else in the business landscape in America you will find that women have such little access to capital and to powerful positions. And this is the stat that I kept on getting stuck on that really inspired me to write the book. Female founders over the past decade have drawn an average of about 3% of all venture capital dollars. So as I was interviewing the women who did manage to secure those VC dollars, I was so impressed by them. And I heard them answering questions in different ways. They were talking more about long-term planning. They were solving different types of problems. And I would leave these conversations so inspired and in many ways surprised by their approaches that I realized, of course, these women are different. They've had to be exceptional to defy these crazy odds against them. By the way, that 3% declined to 2% last year of all VC dollars to female founders. And then it declined again. Currently in Q3, Q4, it's less than 2% of all VC dollars. So, CNBC, our whole business culture, everyone cares about outliers, people who have defied the odds, people who are successful in remarkable ways. And I thought this is an amazing opportunity to talk about really exceptional people, successful business entrepreneurs in general. Yes, that they're exceptional, but to be among that 2% of people who've gotten access to the venture capital dollars, or the people who've gotten access to that 2% of dollars, those people are even more exceptional. Let me figure out how they did it. how they manage to defy the odds, what their skills and strategies are that enable them to be among those very, very rare few. And it was really about trying to understand their odds-defying characteristics that led me to want to write the book. In terms of how I picked the people, I wanted it very much to be a mix of people who you've heard of before. Sally Krawcheck was once the most powerful woman on Wall Street. Whitney Wolfe Herd founded Bumble, took it public. Jennifer Hyman founded Rent the Runway, took it public. So people who you had heard of before. Gwyneth Paltrow's in the book. Reese Witherspoon and Sarah Hardin, CEO, who run Hello Sunshine. So people you've heard of with a different angle and different stories that you've never heard before. So that was one part of the book, with a mix of other people you've never heard of who are running amazing companies and whose success stories will knock your socks off. So I wanted it to really be a mix of the familiar, but with a new take, and the unfamiliar, and then a very wide variety of age, background, people who had gone to Harvard and then Harvard Business School, people who immigrated to the US when they were grad students in engineering and ended up at University of Texas, different racial backgrounds. So really an incredible diversity in the types of founders and also in their leadership styles. So as someone who sees big CEOs on TV all the time, I interview them every week, I wanted to introduce very different types of leadership traits, personalities, and archetypes to the conversation.
And you did that unbelievably well. There's
Thank
two
you.
that I wanted to talk to you about, and I'll save that for a little bit, but Irma and Gwyneth Paltrow. But one of the things that you talk a lot about in the book is that there are traits amongst women founders and leaders that are viewed as flaws that are really superpowers. And I think it's fascinating to talk about vulnerability and empathy, but I'll let you run with that. Talk about those traits that a lot of people see as flaws that are actually superpowers that make them phenomenal leaders.
Yeah, and so my process for this, which I think you all might appreciate, is I started with the interviews, right? I'm a journalist. I started with the interviews. I've done probably 10,000 interviews over my career with big CEOs, but for this, I did 120 interviews just for this book. And after each interview, I would pull out the key traits and the key skill sets and strategies. And then I found all this research. I ended up reading about 300 academic studies that were very relevant to these skills and strategies. And I found female leaders are more likely to lead with a couple of key approaches. With empathy, women rank higher in empathy. I had a conversation last week with a VC who was like, isn't it empathy just about being nice? That is not the definition of empathy. Empathy can lead to compassion, but I think it's really important to identify the strategic advantages of empathy. If you could put yourself into someone else's shoes, understand what they might be thinking or feeling, you will be a better negotiator against them. You'll be better able to motivate them as an employee or better able to sell products to them as a customer. So I think there's this conflation of empathy and kindness, which aren't really necessarily related. It's important to separate them out. Same is true of vulnerability. Vulnerability, when paired with a core competency, obviously you shouldn't say I don't know anything, but women are more likely to lead with vulnerability and to use that vulnerability to invite collaboration. Women are also more likely to lead in a communal way, to bring in perspectives from across an organization. And they're also more likely to take a divergent approach. So pulling on threads and asking about things that are tangential to have a broader, more complex understanding of the entire universe that you're talking about, rather than rushing and converging and taking a convergent approach to solve the problems of a particular tree. So if you're talking about the forest and the trees, there are advantages to the more typically male approach of rushing to put a Band-Aid on the tree and fix the tree. But what I have found, especially as women tend to rank higher in adaptability, women tend to have a higher what they call adaptability quotient. I have found the correlation between that and having taken the time previously to understand the universe. When the situation changes, and adaptability is all about using data to look around corners and make swift decisions, if you've already taken the time to have the divergent approach and pull on the threads and understand the broader universe, you're better equipped when you need to make a swift decision and be highly adaptable. So all of these traits are things that are socialized. None of these things are biological. There can be a biological component, but that is not where my research lies. I'm a journalist and not a doctor or a biologist. And I think what's so important about these skills and strategies is they are things that women are more likely to do, but men and everyone will be more successful if they bring these strategies into their approaches. I was looking back at my bookshelves of business books, and books like Jim Collins' Good to Great, which was like a Bible for me when I was a young journalist at Fortune magazine. And what's so interesting about that book is it very much was of the era of the sort of GE style of leadership. And there have been other trends in leadership, such as the Mark Zuckerberg move fast and break things model of the past decade, which I think is now over. But I think we're at a new moment of leadership, and all of the challenges and uncertainty that we're seeing right now in the business world, whether it's pending recession, questions about inflation, how high is it really? All of these challenges, I think, necessitate a new examination of what it means to be a good leader. And I think that the stories and data and research in my book really highlight the fact that these skills and strategies that have been overlooked for so long it's time that they come to the forefront. And so to your original question about this idea of taking characteristics that have sometimes been seen as flaws and deploying them as superpowers, one commonality I found among all of these very diverse women is that their self-knowledge and their ability to really examine their own skill set, push themselves to improve at the things that they could improve at, and to compensate for their weaknesses by being open and vulnerable about them and inviting collaboration. That self-knowledge is all about taking your own traits, flaws or not, and turning them into superpowers. And so whether it's this idea of vulnerability, which has been traditionally associated with weakness, or even something as simple as being an introvert, there are a number of female CEOs I write about in this book who are introverts, and their businesses hinge on pitching and promoting their companies to the world. And I think of one named Jennifer Holmgren. She's the CEO of a biotech company that turns pollution into fuel. Her whole company and success is all hinged on her ability to pitch to factories and also to fuel buyers like Virgin Atlantic to buy her fuel. And she hates to talk. She's a soft-spoken immigrant who really hates to speak. So the fact that she's been able to turn her introversion into an advantage is something that everyone can learn from, whether you're an introvert or not. And what I really dug into is this idea that she said, yeah, I don't like to talk. And instead of letting that hold me back, what I did is I used my listening to really understand what people really wanted. So back to the empathy. If you aren't anxious about getting a word in edgewise, you can hear what someone really wants, not what they say that they want at the beginning of the conversation, but what it is that they actually want, because you've given them space to really talk. And so she's used this to be an amazing negotiator. She's raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Her company is now valued in the billions of dollars. And she's done so despite having this trait that many people would have assumed would have never enabled her to succeed, which is being an introvert.
Amazing. You talk about being a communal leader. What does that mean, and why is that so powerful?
So back to the old GE model of leadership, that was about top down, being good at delegating, cutting the bottom 10%, and all about the sort of top down model. Communal leadership is this idea that the leader is more successful if they can pull on perspectives from across an organization, and that they should be humble about their own opinions while they're gathering data. So the pandemic really shed light on the fact that everyone's situation can be so different in these times of crisis. And also things can change so quickly. So the best leaders were those that are asking people on the ground, what are you seeing? What kinds of decisions would you make based on your perspective in this city? Or, I was just talking with an economist about how there was such varied impact of the pandemic on different regions based on the lockdown laws. So saying, what are you seeing? What would your opinion be? And if you gather that perspective from across an organization and use that data as a leader to make your final analysis, then you're going to be stronger rather than doing things in a top-down way. So really counting on the people around you to be honest and open about what they're seeing and trusting their expertise as a way to fuel your own decision-making rather than making decisions in a top-down way.
I have so many questions for you. I'm going to have to skip a lot of them. So I think one of the things that we've really enjoyed as a community is reading books like Dahlia Feldheim's book, Dare to Lead Like a Girl, and reading Iman Obu's book, The Glass Ledge.
Have you read mine yet? Has the community read mine yet?
Of course. Okay. So, I think oftentimes people think these books are for females to be read by women, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
What are the lessons that you would want men to take away from your incredible book?
I really, our audience at CNBC is mostly men, or it's largely men. And it's men who dominate the VC investing community and who dominate power positions in business. So I definitely wrote my book for men to read, despite the fact that women is very boldly on the cover. I have two main takeaways that I want men to get from this book, and I'm glad that you read it. Number one is I think it is this is a moment to learn from the success of female leaders who have defied the odds. We should always be trying to learn from people who've defied the odds, but these women defied very, very high odds. Men can learn from them and can adopt these approaches. I see men do it all the time, pick up some of these things here and there. And I think there are plenty of great examples of how men have tried to make some of these more traditionally female leadership traits central to their approaches. People like Howard Schultz or Fred Smith have talked about the importance of servant leadership, which is, number one, something women are more likely to lead with, and number two, something that is actually more successful when women lead with that approach. So I think for men, takeaway number one is learn from these women's skills and strategies, see the value that is gained when you lead in different ways in these sort of sine curve of trends of leadership we've seen over the past several decades. This is the new model for leadership in the uncertain times where empathy and vulnerability are table stakes, especially if you're dealing with managing employees, because we've seen all this data about great resignation, et cetera, quiet quitting. So that's takeaway number one, learn from these women. Takeaway number two is there is remarkable specific data about the value of diversity in teams. Not just what I assumed going into this book, that you get smarter if you have an outside perspective. That is one part of the value of diversity, but there is great data showing that the whole group gets smarter. Everyone else in a team raises the level of their game when they have other people who are unlike them join the group. And there's a great example in here. I don't know if you all read it, the example of the fraternity and sorority brothers and sisters at Northwestern. To me, that really articulates the value of everyone for introducing diversity. So I would say, understand the data about the massive gender gaps and the value in closing them, because everyone here will be more successful if they can leverage that as an arbitrage opportunity and just use that data to their advantage. I think for forever, people have not had the ability to use data to overcome bias. And now we're finally able to gather some of that data to understand the prevalence of bias, which, by the way, women have as well, and to use that data to make better decisions.
Phenomenal. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, so I've got to turn it over.
Sorry, my answers were too long.
No, they're phenomenal. This laundry list of people who have got tons of questions for you. We're going to start with Sunny in Arizona. Sunny, you're up with Julia.
All right. Thank you, Julia. It is great to just be able to have you and hear your perspective of everything. And so my specific question for you is, we are experiencing within kind of the corporate world, the latest coined term is the great breakup, right? So we have droves of women who I think are no longer willing to accept the old standard of rules. They don't want to play by that game anymore. So they're going to a new organization or they're creating their own. And so I am passionate about the advancement of women in leadership. It's something that I've had poured into me and I continue to pour into others. And so with that, what advice would you have for women who have been told these traits are a form of weakness or that doesn't make them a strong leader, so that they can flip the script and tap into that power that they actually hold inside of these traits?
I mean, that's exactly what my book is about, saying that these traits are strengths, not weaknesses. And not only should women be tapping into them and treating them as superpowers, but also men should be emulating them. So that is really the entire message of my book, or that is a key part of the message of my book. To explain the great breakup to anyone who has not seen this study, about a month or 6 weeks ago, McKinsey and LinkedIn issued their annual report on the state of women in the workforce. The key takeaway this year is something they've never seen before, and that is that women at the VP level and above are leaving their jobs in record numbers. The reason this great breakup is so concerning for women like you and for women like me is because the implications of this are massive. If these women do not join other organizations, then there will be an entire generation of senior women who is not mentoring younger people, both male and female, and also not participating in impacting the culture at big organizations. This is the McKinsey Lean In study. We could probably find a link and put it into the chat.
I've got the
So I
link.
think that the implications of this great breakup of these senior women can be so negative if they do not join other companies. If they're doing solo entrepreneur things where they're just consulting, that's fine, but they're also going to lose their impact on society effectively that you have when you have a corporate culture. So I think that I've been speaking at a lot of business schools and trying to get the word out to younger women to understand the importance of leading in their own way and not being defined by some of these archetypes that have been so dominant. But I also think for companies, for corporate America, they need to understand the importance of retaining this talent, because otherwise the whole culture will shift if they lose too many of these women. Thank you for sharing that study link. I'd also point out there's a great graphic in there that looks like pipes, and it shows a declining pipeline and how at every level of promotion, women and people of color miss out. And that's why there's a lack of female leadership in the C-suite. It's not just at the very highest levels, it's throughout the promotion.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the context.
So we have the author of Dare to Lead Like a Girl, Dalia. I'm assuming you're in Israel.
I am. I'm actually late at night. Julia, it's such a pleasure to be here. And yes, I think we're totally aligned, and I have so many questions. But my key one, I mean, my book is about very similar topics, as mentioned earlier, in the sense that, you know, I've spent 21 years in the corporate world. I've seen the advantages of the female leadership traits. I did spend 3 years with a toxic boss, and I wanted to ask you what you saw working in order to convert, making sure that we're not speaking to the converted, but actually what works for those GE style top-down leadership, you know, to convert them.
I think it's greed. I think it's greed. And I mean, I always think at CNBC, I have very much tried to change the conversation about diversity from being like a philanthropic nice thing to do. If companies are treating like their DEI groups or pay equity projects as like a nice thing to do for their employees, like a corporate perk, then they are losing the thread. The reality is that investing in diversity, having more women in leadership is not a nice thing to do for your employees. It is the best thing to do financially for the corporation. And I think the more we can get this wealth of data out there about the financial benefits of diversity, the more that bosses are going to think, this is not about me being nice. This is about me being greedy. And if you want to be successful, you need to have more women and people of color represented in leadership positions. And so I think it's about switching the conversation. So that's why when I do my Closing the Gap stories at CNBC, I'm not talking about like philanthropy, right? I'm talking about this
ROI.
ROI. And I think it is incredibly frustrating to me to see that, you know, I have 40 pages of endnotes in here and that's why I really want to have the endnotes published in the book, to really indicate that this is not a lightweight endeavor and that companies need to be thinking differently about the advantages of having different kinds of leadership.
Oh, we're totally aligned. I look forward to connecting with you.
I can't wait to connect with you.
Thank you.
It's so powerful because it is true. Diversity is, you know, kind of framed as this kumbaya type of thing, as opposed to, you know, what really is going to drive bottom line results.
And by the way, kumbaya is like everything is nice and happy, but diversity can be tough. And that's one of the reasons
100%.
I like these studies is that people get smarter from diversity, but it doesn't always feel good. It feels hard. And that hardness and that challenge is what makes people smarter and come up with better ideas.
I just have to say, my toxic boss used to call me Miss Kumbaya because I was too positive. And we know from research that being positive is good for business. So I'm totally with you.
Yeah.
Loved it. Thank you for joining us. We're going to Scott in Illinois. Scott, you're up.
Hi, Julia. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here and the rest of the family here, I'll call it, today. I did buy 2 of your books just like 5 minutes ago, one for myself and one to give. So
Great.
I was going to ask a totally technical question because I know you follow a lot of technology stuff, but I'm very passionate about leadership and development, and that's my wheelhouse. And as a retired military officer who who ran an Air Force base. I had an incredible vice commander for a year, and she and I would spend hours about how we are seeing this change from transactional leadership to more of a transformational leadership, where we need to provide the skills and training and education more in, and I hate this term, soft skills, but more on the harder life skills is what I would like to call them. And she and I have both been certified in Brene Brown's Dare to Lead and Talent Smart's emotional intelligence courses. And so we would just go out as leaders and train as many airmen as we could. Do you kind of agree, like, this is the change that you see? Is it transformational leadership, or are we terming it the wrong way? Are these kind of the ideas that you're talking about?
I think that there is a huge overlap with those ideas, and I think that's a part of it. But I also think it's this idea that everyone should lead in the way that's most authentic to them, and so I think transformational leadership is this sort of overall big picture, description of what you've been trained in. But I think what's most important is for leaders, especially leaders who don't fit themselves into a box, to take their own unique skills and traits and think about them as their own unique advantages. Not everyone should lead in exactly the same way, right? And it's about saying, to be educated on what those skills are that Brene Brown teaches, but to understand that they need to put them into a context that's authentic to them. And you must have a very different perspective than other leaders do because of your experience on military bases and working in that structure. So I think the authenticity is essential. And there's so much research. And I even see this on TV, that a lack of authenticity can backfire. And so if all of these things are just adopted, like, oh, I'm just going to say the right things because I've learned the things to say, it doesn't work. And I'm sure you know this, but the authenticity is really essential. And so for instance, I've seen so many of these women say that they had to level set and say, look, I know I'm managing people who are older than me. I've hired people who have a lot more experience than me, and I need to figure out how to do it in a way that's very respectful. And so it's a different kind of conversation rather than if you're managing a team that may be younger and more inexperienced than you. So I think it's all sort of within the context of the individual, and also the company, depending on what the company is doing. I think about someone like Katrina Lake, who founded Stitch Fix, and at the time she took it public was the youngest woman to take a company public that she had founded. And she was described as a talent magnet by about 20 people who told me she was a talent magnet. And I said, gee, that sounds like an amazing thing. Like, let me find the research on what it means to be a talent magnet. Like, I'm sure all of us would love to be talent magnets. And I was like, what's the magic sauce? What's the secret sauce about being a talent magnet? Because there must be studies on this. There are no studies on how one becomes a talent magnet. This is not a thing. It's not a gene. It's not a skill set. But what was so interesting about her is I said, explain to me how you did that. And I pushed and I pushed. And this was like, I was like really trying to fill this hole in the chapter. And she said, look, nobody wants to work for know-it-all. And I just was very honest that, like, I had this great idea for business. I knew nothing about algorithms. So I cold emailed the VP of algorithms for Netflix. She ended up hiring the VP of algorithms for Netflix when Stitch Fix was a tiny company, not by following any playbook, but just by being very authentic to herself. This is what I know. This is the business. This is why I understand this business. This is what I do not know. She ended up also hiring the COO of Walmart.com. So I think it's understanding these new leadership styles that are being celebrated, like what you're learning from Brene Brown, but also figuring out how to make it authentic within your own personal experience. And I think transparency is a key part of that. So it's like, if you think, growth mindset is so essential, but I think so much of a part of having a growth mindset as a leader is the humility to understand that you don't know everything. So it's sort of like that, to me, I like the new definition of growth mindset for me is like the balance of confidence that you can learn anything and the humility to know that you don't know everything, and the combination of those things. But I think, I guess my long-winded answer is like, I think, yes, everything you're saying is right, but it all needs to be contextualized for the person, their experience.
Thank you.
Fantastic. We are going to Ohio. Dr. Stacy Feiner, you're up.
Whoop, whoop. Fire in the house. Nice to see everybody. Really great to be part of the community. It's been a while. Julia, just magnificent, just brilliant and reassuring and innovative and common sense, and just a whole bunch of combination of reactions to this. I'm I'm actually writing a book based recognizing many of the qualities that you're talking about. I have them listed down, and we're going to be using the psychology of women to explain, where these traits come from. It's going to be sociological and psychological. But
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, I can't wait. October. I am curious. Here you have a book of exemplaries, and how does this translate to the mainstream population? So how do we, is there a handbook version, so to speak, of your book that allows those of us who perhaps are not as outliers, to borrow these tools and shape a leadership philosophy and model, really for the populace,
So I am talking to the publisher about potentially putting together some sort of a workbook. But I would say that currently, if you go to the epilogue of my book, the very last chapter, the epilogue, is my 5 key takeaways, which function as a kind of roadmap for how to deploy these in your own life. For instance, one of my key ones, and I have to find the epilogue here, is this idea that superpowers don't always look like powers, and to identify what your own superpower is, that is just a trait that you have that you could deploy to your own advantage. Or another one is that, it takes a different kind of village than you ever expected. And just looking at the diversity of relationships that each of these women in the book pulled upon in order to succeed, not just the idea of traditional mentors. So if you go to the epilogue in the book, you'll see I sort of lay it out more specifically, but I would like to eventually turn this into a workbook. There's some illegal version of a workbook that someone created on Amazon, so do not buy that one. That is fake. That someone read my book and created a workbook, a fake one, and you'll get so don't buy that one. Just buy my book and flip to the epilogue.
And how do you practice these things? What are good examples of your use of these traits in the work that you do?
Well, I would say the first thing that's really transformed my outlook on the world is that before reporting and writing this book, I used to subscribe to the serenity prayer, don't try to the things that you can't control them. So don't think about them. Don't let them bother you. What I realized in reporting this book is that there are probably 50 ways in which women face double standards and are judged more harshly than men. I had a stack of reports. And women are judged more harshly for showing any emotion, for using humor in the workplace, for showing anger in the workplace, obviously, for they're judged more harshly if they succeed in male dominated fields, for failing in female dominated fields. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on. I didn't want to write about that data. I found it depressing. I am like Dahlia, an optimist. I am positive. And what I realized in having read that research and going about my everyday life is that it is essential to understand the obstacles you cannot control. The more you understand them, the better you can navigate them and also not let them bother you. So there have now been numerous occasions, both before the book came out and since then, where I have faced ridiculous bias or stereotypes, such as the assumption that women are supposed to be nurturing and warm all the time. That is a dominant stereotype of women. Women are expected to demonstrate warmth and nurturing. And the comments I've gotten in those situations when I'm doing my job, which is not involved being warm and nurturing, have been the kind of thing that previously would have set me into a panic, rewatching tapes, wondering if I'd been too harsh or mean, which were the terms that were used to describe me in interviews. But now when a man says like, oh, your interview seemed really mean, I have said, oh, gee, I don't think you would have given the same feedback to one of my male colleagues. Like, I thought it was really fair and I thought it was a really good interview. The subject didn't seem to think I was mean. But so I think just having a knowledge of those double standards or any kind of obstacles has been so empowering to not let it bother me because it's not about me. That comment really has nothing to do with me and everything to do with his assumptions and stereotypes. And then also to be able to glean from those conversations the really valuable stuff. I can get better feedback if I'm not distracted by the comments that are seated in bias.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Doug in Florida, you're up with Julia.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Kathy. Julia, amazing, sensational conversation. As always, I feel like if I didn't ask about this topic, It's almost a dereliction of duty today, given what you do report on in the intersection of all of it, which is Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, and where you see that story leading and unraveling. And is that something that's occupying some of your reporting time? Thank you so much.
I don't currently cover cryptocurrency. In the very early days, as part of my Disruptor 50 work, I did a lot more in crypto. I have an amazing colleague named Kate Rooney, who's all over this story, and she's doing such a good job. So I highly recommend following her on Twitter. She's awesome. It's so funny because one of the ways Sam Bankman-Fried has come up in this conversation as I've been on book tour is, what would the scrutiny be if he were a woman? And I said, if Sam Bankman-Fried was Samantha Bankman-Fried, he never would have raised all that money. Look at the access to capital he had. I mean, are you kidding me? There's no way a woman would have raised that much capital for a company like this. So it's fascinating to watch this. I think as a business reporter, I'm most interested in what kind of implications this has for the rest of the crypto landscape. I think sometimes crypto gets wrapped in with Web3, which gets wrapped in with metaverse. And what's going on right now really has nothing to do with crypto or blockchain, because it was a fraudulent situation. Like, he defrauded people of money, or at least we're supposed to say allegedly. He allegedly defrauded people of money. It appears as if. So it's going to be interesting to watch what happens, and also how much it impacts investment in the category and consumer trust in the category. Because there was this moment where, Bitcoin and all of these different cryptocurrencies seemed accessible, and like this was going to be the next investable category. But now I think it could really impact consumer trust and consumer sort of the amount that consumers are playing in this space.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Crazy to watch, right? It's like
unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's honestly, to me, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it impacts Randy and I, because we are massive Miami Heat fans, and clearly the FTX arena is going to be renamed.
Yes, that is true.
Yeah, it's coming to a Netflix special soon.
Yeah,
For
I
sure.
cannot wait.
Yeah.
Who's going to play him? That's what I was wondering.
Right. Kathy Slayton in Florida, you are up with Julia.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. So, hey, Julie again. And so here's my question. I'm going to kind of dovetail a little bit on what Sunny had asked earlier, and a little bit about what Dr. Stacy asked about as well. So I've been in the IT consulting industry for around 20 years, let's just say, give or take a few. And so what I have seen is, in particular, and it's not necessarily what I've witnessed, is not necessarily those skill sets that we've been talking about today that maybe make or break a woman's career. It's age. And what I have witnessed is that once a woman in this field kind of gets to be a certain age, she might get put out to pasture. And so the promotions aren't there, the large consulting engagements aren't there, and so that type of thing. But if you're a man and you're 65, an old crusty sea dog, you're going to maintain being a partner, and that's kind of so I just wanted to hear your perspective on that. And because it seems like the tide is somewhat turning for women in these leadership roles if you are younger. But if you have reached a certain age, I know this is controversial, and but that's the,
I think that you're talking about something very real. And there are two women in the book who talk about this. One is Julie Wainwright, who was the CEO of The Real Real. And she was told she was too old before she founded The Real Real, which she then took public. She was told she was too old to ever get a job again. She was also CEO of Pets.com around that disaster in 2000. But she said, you were too old and you're a woman. Those are two strikes against you. Deidre Paknad, who's the CEO of Workboard, which is a big enterprise software company, has also been told she was she's a woman, and B, she's too old, which are two strikes against her. So this is something that a number of women have talked about. Interestingly, when you look at the research around intersectionality, we think of intersectionality as referring to race, this idea of multiple marginalized identities. Gender and race are usually the two we're talking about, sometimes sexuality. But what's interesting is that age is another element that plays into it. So if you're a woman and you're old, those are two marginalized identities, and you're going to be maybe minimized because of that. So it's interesting. I think it's very important that people talk about it. And also, I think that this is another reason why when it comes to things like promotions, it's really important to use data rather than relying on sort of instinct or impulse, or like this person seems like they'd be a good fit for the organization. It's also particularly interesting for me seeing people like Bob Iger return. He retired in no small part because he was getting older, but now you have this generation of leaders of these companies who are incredibly, older compared to how sort of what was considered a responsible retirement age. So you're right to identify the bias in terms of what it'll take to change it. Hopefully some very successful women in their 60s are going to help change the patterns of what it looks like to be a successful woman. So I think the more that everyone can highlight those success stories, the more it changes the expectations that women are only going to be more important when they're younger. But I do think that this society in general does have a bias towards youth, and that's why we idolize these young men who are the Mark Zuckerberg model, or frankly Sam Bankman-Fried. His youth was seen as an advantage, but I think the conversation around that may change.
Perfect. Thank you.
Jeff Gamble in Connecticut, you're up.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Julia, hello.
Hello.
It's nice to see you. Nice to meet you. Thanks for being here. I've got your book right here, Julia.
Yay.
And I wanted to ask you, you spoke about a lot of companies so far. You spoke about a lot of people so far. We've got a bunch of folks in this book. Who's on your docket coming up next week, next month, that you just can't wait to talk to, that you're hoping you're going to say, wow, what an individual. Somebody we probably don't know about. Is there somebody there that we should know about now that you're going to be talking to?
Well, next week I'm going on vacation. So next week I'm on vacation. But I'm actually, it's interesting because I'm right now planning ahead for the Consumer Electronics Show. And we're trying to figure out what companies to highlight and focus on there. And I won't name any companies, but there are two categories that I'm really interested in. And one is VR and metaverse technology. And this question of, now that Facebook is less focused on metaverse as they focus on their bread and butter, how will this innovative technology be used? And how is it going to be sort of used more as an enterprise tool? And so that I think is a really interesting thing to watch, this idea of forgetting about VR as a consumer tool for now and thinking about more how companies are going to use it. The other thing is the importance of sustainability and technology. Last year, or this past year, through the Disruptor 50, we did a lot of work on infrastructure companies and also transportation companies. So companies like Flock Freight that are in their efficiency and improving supply chain logistics are benefiting the environment. And I think that we're going to see more and more companies that are trying to align their successful outcomes with positive environmental impact. So I think that's going to be a big tech trend we're seeing. So I'm not sure which companies I would flag just yet because we haven't figured out our interviews for CES, but as much as going to Las Vegas with 150,000 other people is a nightmare, I'm really excited to see what the technologies are there.
Yes, I've had the pleasure of being to one Consumer Electronics Show, and it's like a kid in a candy box or toy, whatever that term is.
Yeah.
I mean, you think you're seeing something amazing until you turn the corner, you go, oh, wait, this is amazing. Good.
So I'll have a better answer for you after that. But actually, you should follow along with our Disruptor 50 stuff because we have a great newsletter that really highlights some of those companies' evolutions and also what's next out of there.
Great. Thank you, Julia.
Our cleanup hitter today is our favorite Olympic gold medalist in Spain, Joe Jacoby. You're up.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much for being here today. As Scott mentioned, I live far from the U.S. I haven't been to the U.S. in a while. I have not read your book, but I look forward to doing so. I was wondering if in the people that you profiled, if there were leaders who came from outside of the United States and what some of the what you notice were some of the differences, challenges, and opportunities, strengths and weaknesses, opportunities, challenges with leaders who've come from outside of the U.S. and are now leading inside the U.S. I do follow a few that are from here in Catalonia, and I'm familiar with the cultural upbringing, and I see them kind of using that to their advantage. But I'm curious to what you see with leaders who come from outside of the U.S. and are leading inside the U.S. now.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And by the way, hello. I'm jealous that you're in Spain right now. That sounds amazing. So the book is focused mostly on people who are running companies based in the US, but many of them did come from outside of the US. So earlier I mentioned Jennifer Holmgren, the CEO of a company called LanzaTech. Another example is a woman, Meena Sankaran, who's the CEO of a water tech company called Ketos. And what they do is they do water measurement. It's a B2B company, so you probably have not heard of it, but they do water measurement and also safety. She came from India. She moved here as a grad student. And what's so interesting about her is that she used her perspective, having grown up in India, where you had to boil water 4 times in order to be able to drink it, to understand that this was a major issue. Her technology was first deployed in the US. About 40%, I think her stat is that 40% of all water is wasted, broken pipes, leaks, et cetera, evaporation, and also that there's so much water that is unsafe to drink and unsafe to use on crops. So she knew in India this was a problem. People talked about it. You couldn't drink water out of the tap. But when she came to the US, she saw that investors were not prioritizing this because it wasn't something that was a problem that was proximate to them. VCs live in Menlo Park and Atherton, and they were not aware of the vast sort of the immense size of the water safety problem here in the US, let alone abroad. So she used her perspective as an outsider to the US culture, at least of the US tech culture, to identify a problem that she saw was not only a global problem, but also one here in the US. She also had great resilience. And it's funny because great resilience and a very different sort of sense of work ethic, because she had grown up with literally nothing. And she said she felt grateful every day that, that she had the opportunity to be here and solve these big problems. So one of the investors I talk about in the book is named Frida Kapor-Klein and her husband, Mitch Kapor. They have an investment fund. And one of their key tenets of figuring out who to invest in is this person, the founder's proximity to a problem, how well they understand a problem. And I think one advantage of having people come from outside the US is they have a very different perspective or a very different understanding of what the problems are. Another amazing CEO I would flag is a woman named Toyin Ajayi, Dr. Toyin Ajayi. She grew up in Africa. She went to school in the US and in the UK, but she lived in Nairobi with her family. And then ultimately, between medical school at Cambridge and doing her residency in Boston, she went to Sierra Leone, where she was working at a pediatric hospital there. There, she determined her fundamental philosophy to fixing problems in business. In Sierra Leone, this pediatric hospital, which was relatively new for the country, did not have running water. There were pipes coming in, but there was no running water. And she'd gone there to improve the medical issues, but she discovered that she couldn't do anything until she fixed the running water. So she sort of created this philosophy of understanding that in any situation, you have the problem itself, which is the poor medical care the children are receiving, but then you have the underlying problem. You can't do anything until you fix the water supply. And so this was an approach that she developed working in Sierra Leone. And when she came to Boston Medical and was a resident there, she said, there's another fundamental problem. You have water here, but you don't have trust with the patients, and patients are being discharged from the emergency room out to the street because they don't have housing, they don't have social services. So she used this concept of what is the water supply that is broken and needs to be fixed? What is the underlying problem, to create her entire business philosophy. So now City Block Health, her company, which is valued in the billions of dollars, they provide social services to their patients. So they have people who are like social workers who help their patients get housing or access to food or whatever it is they need to actually help them be healthier, separate from their medical issues. And I think this concept of treating the water supply first is something that she probably wouldn't have understood had she not had that hands-on experience. So it's just amazing thinking about how these experiences from different cultures can really impact the way you're solving problems here.
You were mentioning
Awesome.
water, and I am horrified to say that John Walsh, who is the CFO of Voss Water, had put his name in to ask a question John, if you can ask a question in 30 seconds and Julie can answer it in 15, I'm going to let you go.
Thanks, Scott. I thought you were, I was good passing on it, but hi, Julia. My question real quickly really was just about that Bob I, Bob C comparison that you mentioned. I spent 20 years at Disney and I had the good fortune of presenting to both of them a number of times. So I have a perspective, but I think it's a really interesting case study that you could maybe share in a couple seconds or so with this group on your perspective of the difference between those two.
I think there's a different priority of the creative, the creative business, and whether you're putting the creative first or the data first. And running a theme park is a lot more about the logistics of the operating a theme park business, which was his background, or the distribution of the content. But I think Iger really elevates and prioritizes the creative producers and the creative process. And I think in a creative business, it's hard to turn it into widgets and zeros and ones. That would be my short answer.
Yeah, I would just say, Scott, real quick, for this group to know, again, I spent many years there. I've never seen a CEO, both of them, where you can feel their leadership all the way down to the front line. So 100,000 cast members across the world, there was a palpable difference between the two. So as leaders, having that in the organization is important. So thanks, Julia.
Totally.
Fantastic.
I'm
Julia,
so
this
sorry.
has been
I have to
unbelievable. Thank you so much. Anyone who wants to stay on, feel free to stay on for some overtime. Write a review for Julia's book. It'll be a huge help. Kathy, take us out.
Okay, I'm going to take off. Bye.
This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made.
Oh, that was a fun, fast hour with an absolutely remarkable person. I had a kick-ass question for her that obviously we ran out of time, or I think it's a good question. So I think most people know Elizabeth Holmes, the former CEO of Theranos, and she is a woman who raised an insane amount of money. But I was curious to find out if Julia thought, was it the technology or was it a combination of Elizabeth Holmes' affect was very male dominant? As a matter of fact, a lot of people thought she was literally copying Steve Jobs and